All right, so we are ready to dive deep into the life of a president. I think a lot of people have forgotten about Chester A. Arthur.
Yeah.
You've sent us a whole bunch of sources about him.
Yeah.
And I think our mission here is to really try to understand how this guy went from being like a hardcore New York political operator
Yeah.
to a reformer who really changed the presidency itself.
It's a fascinating story, and it really is.
Yeah.
You see, Arthur starts out in the notoriously corrupt New York Custom House under the powerful Roscoe Conkling.
Okay.
So imagine a system where loyalty gets you a job, not skill.
Oh, wow.
And that was the Custom House in a nutshell.
That sounds more like a mob hangout than a government institution.
Well, it wasn't far off.
Really?
The Custom House was responsible for 75% of federal revenue through tariffs and customs fees.
Oh, wow.
Controlling it meant controlling serious power and money.
Yeah.
And Arthur was Conkling's right-hand man,
Okay.
deeply embedded in this system of patronage, the spoils system, that's what it's called.
Right. So we've got Arthur, knee-deep in the swamp, and then boom! Garfield's assassination makes him president.
Ugh.
How did that change things?
Total shock,
Yeah.
both politically and personally.
Yeah.
This guy known for backroom deals and patronage
Yeah.
suddenly had to lead the nation.
Talk about a career change.
Yeah.
So the sources mentioned these groups called stalwarts and half-breeds within the Republican Party during Arthur's time.
Okay.
Can you refresh our listeners' memories on who those folks were?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So the stalwarts, led by Conkling, were all about maintaining the status quo, including the spoils system they believed in, rewarding loyalists with government jobs.
Right.
It was politics as usual for them.
Okay.
On the other hand, you had the half-breeds,
Okay.
who were pushing for reform.
Yeah. Yeah.
They wanted a merit-based civil service where you got hired based on what you knew, not who you knew.
Right, right.
So very different approaches to government.
So Arthur, a Conkling man,
Yeah.
obviously was a stalwart.
You would think so, right?
Yeah.
But that's where things get really interesting.
Okay.
After Garfield's death, Arthur has this pivotal meeting with Conkling,
Uh-huh.
and a reporter was actually hiding in the corner, eavesdropping on their conversation.
Oh.
And that's how we know what went down.
Okay.
Conkling urges Arthur to stick with the stalwart way. But Arthur basically told him he was going to be his own man.
Wow. So he saw the presidency as a chance to like break free from Conkling's shadow
Yeah.
and chart his own course. Pretty bold.
It is, and he follows through.
Okay.
Arthur ends up championing the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act,
Okay.
which established a merit-based system for federal jobs. It was a complete 180 from his past,
Wow.
and it was revolutionary.
Okay, hold on. Revolutionary. We're talking about a law about hiring government workers.
Right.
Help me understand why this is such a big deal.
Sure. Think about it this way. Before the Pendleton Act, government jobs were basically rewards for political loyalty. That meant the government wasn't necessarily filled with the most competent people, and it was also vulnerable to corruption.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
The Pendleton Act changed all that.
Okay.
By professionalizing the civil service, it made the government more efficient and less susceptible to political manipulation.
But this happened back in the 1880s. So how does the Pendleton Act impact our lives, in the 21st century?
Well, it's more relevant than you might think. Remember when you mentioned the deep state?
Yeah.
Well, the idea of a professional, nonpartisan civil service that can resist political pressure, that goes all the way back to the Pendleton Act.
So Arthur's legacy lives on in like the structure of our government today. That's pretty incredible.
It is.
But you also mentioned that the Pendleton Act paved the way for the massive expansion of federal power in the 20th century.
Right.
Can you explain that connection?
Absolutely. So when the government wanted to implement large-scale programs like the New Deal, things like Social Security and the Works Progress Administration, which, by the way, were designed to help people during the Great Depression,
Right.
it needed a competent and impartial bureaucracy to manage them.
Oh, I see.
The Pendleton Act laid the foundation for that bureaucracy.
So in a way, Arthur's efforts to reform the civil service helped make programs like Social Security possible.
Yeah.
That's not something you hear every day.
It's one of those fascinating ripple effects in history.
Yeah,
What seems like a dry technical change in the way government workers are hired
right.
ends up having these huge implications decades later.
Okay, so we've got Arthur championing this massive civil service reform.
Right.
What else was on his agenda? The sources mentioned something about the Navy.
Yeah, this is another area where Arthur's impact is often overlooked.
Okay.
At the time, the U.S. Navy was relying on outdated ships.
Uh-huh.
Arthur recognized that a modern Navy was essential for America's growing role on the world stage. and he initiated a program of shipbuilding and modernization. This laid the foundation for America's emergence as a global naval power in the coming decades.
That makes sense. You can't be a major player on the world stage if your ships are stuck in the age of sail.
Exactly.
But wait, didn't Teddy Roosevelt also have a thing for the Navy?
He did, and that's where this gets really interesting.
Okay.
Roosevelt later became Assistant Naval Secretary
Uh-huh.
and continued the push for a stronger Navy.
Wow.
It highlights how interconnected history is,
Yeah.
how the decisions of one president can have unintended consequences for generations to come.
So Arthur's focus on naval modernization could be seen as setting the stage for America's dominance at sea in the 20th century.
Yeah,
That's a pretty significant legacy.
it is, and it all goes back to a president who, honestly, most people don't even remember.
Okay, but before we start planning Arthur's presidential library, the sources also mention some, let's say, less admirable aspects of his presidency.
Yeah,
I'm talking about the Chinese Exclusion Act.
right. That's the dark side of Arthur's legacy. He signed into law the Chinese Exclusion Act,
Yeah.
which barred Chinese immigration and denied citizenship to Chinese immigrants already in the country.
Wow.
It was a terrible act, and it reflected the anxieties of the time about immigration and job competition, issues that unfortunately still resonate today.
I have to admit, this is a bit jarring. Here's a guy who champions reform in government, but then he supports this discriminatory policy.
Yeah.
It's hard to reconcile those two things.
It is. Arthur was a product of his time, and his views on race and immigration reflected the prevailing prejudices of the era.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that historical figures are complex individuals capable of both great vision and deeply flawed judgments.
It's a good reminder that progress isn't always linear.
Right.
Sometimes it takes a few steps back to eventually move forward.
Exactly. And it also highlights the importance of context when studying history.
Mm-hmm.
We can't judge historical figures solely by today's standard, but we also can't ignore the impact of their actions.
Okay, so we've got this mix of progress and prejudice reform and retrenchment.
Right. Arthur's presidency wasn't a simple story of good versus bad.
Not at all. And that's what makes it so fascinating.
Right.
It's a nuanced story about a complex individual navigating a complex time.
Well, speaking of complex, the sources mention that Arthur faced a challenge most presidents would envy.
Yeah.
A budget surplus.
I know, right?
A surplus.
A surplus seems almost unimaginable in today's world of trillion-dollar deficits.
Right.
But thanks to those tariffs and customs revenue,
Yeah.
Arthur inherited a substantial surplus.
That must have been a nice problem to have, but what did he actually do with all that extra cash?
He invested in infrastructure, modernized the Navy, and strengthened other parts of the government. He seemed genuinely committed to using the surplus responsibly
Yay.
to improve the country's long-term prospects.
So he didn't just throw a giant party.
Apparently not.
Okay.
He actually considered various options like reducing tariffs,
Yeah.
but ultimately decided that investing in the nation's future was the best use of the surplus. That's pretty impressive. It really does seem like he was trying to leave a positive mark on the presidency, despite his past.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And it makes you think, what could be accomplished today if we had leaders who were similarly focused on long-term investments and fiscal responsibility?
It's a fascinating thought experiment. It's like Arthur's presidency offers us a glimpse into a different way of approaching government finances.
It does, and it reminds us that history can challenge our assumptions about what's possible.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've seen how Arthur rose from the murky depths of New York politics.
Yeah.
How he surprised everyone by becoming a reformer.
Right.
How he modernized the Navy, and even how he handled a budget surplus.
Right.
It's been quite a journey.
It has, and we're not done yet.
Oh.
There's one more twist in Arthur's story that we need to explore.
Ooh.
Stay tuned. All right, we'll be back.
You know, as we've been discussing Arthur's decisions as president, I keep thinking about how his personal life might have influenced his actions.
He was a widower during his time in office, his wife having passed away a few years earlier.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's an interesting thought. It makes you wonder if that loss, that experience of personal tragedy, might have shaped his outlook, his sense of duty.
It's certainly possible.
Yeah.
And it adds another layer of complexity to his story.
Right.
It's a reminder that these historical figures were real people
Yeah.
with real emotions, not just names in a textbook.
Yeah, it's easy to forget that. We
Yeah.
get so caught up in the big events and the political maneuvering
Mm-hmm.
that we lose sight of the human side of history.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And in Arthur's case, it's tempting to speculate whether his personal loss played a role in his commitment to reform to leaving a positive legacy.
Yeah,
Maybe he felt a greater sense of purpose, a desire to make a difference in the world.
it's a compelling theory. And speaking of legacy, the sources mention that Arthur's health suffered during his presidency. He was diagnosed with Bright's disease, a serious kidney ailment,
Right.
which ultimately led to his death shortly after leaving office.
That's right. He died at the relatively young age of 57, just a year after his term ended.
Wow.
It's another reason why he's often overlooked in presidential rankings. He simply didn't have the time to fully implement his vision or solidify his legacy.
It makes you wonder what he might have accomplished if he had had more time.
It does.
Yeah.
But even in that short time, he achieved a great deal. And his legacy, though perhaps understated, continues to shape how we understand government today.
Okay, so we've talked about Arthur's reforms, his modernization of the Navy, his struggles with immigration, and the budget surplus.
Mhm.
But there's one more aspect of his presidency that I find particularly interesting,
If
his
you-
style.
Ah, yes. Arthur was known for his impeccable fashion sense, his elegant manners, and his lavish entertaining.
Right.
He was a true gentleman of the Gilded Age.
He was nicknamed Elegant Arthur for a reason.
Exactly.
And his presidency, in some ways, reflected that attention to style and refinement.
Absolutely. He brought a sense of decorum and sophistication to the White House, restoring its grandeur after the more austere Hayes administration. He redecorated, hired a French chef, and hosted elaborate dinners almost as if he was consciously trying to project an image of a modern and prosperous America.
It's interesting how those seemingly superficial details can actually reveal deeper truths about a presidency.
Right.
So are you saying that Arthur's embrace of elegance and refinement was actually a strategic move?
I think it was part of a larger effort to elevate the standing of the United States on the global stage. Remember, this was a time when America was emerging as a major power,
Right.
and Arthur wanted to project an image that reflected that new status.
So it wasn't just about fancy clothes and fancy dinners. It was about using style as a tool of diplomacy, as a way to signal America's arrival as a world power.
Precisely. And it's a reminder that image matters in politics just as it does in life. Arthur understood that, and he used his personal style to enhance the prestige of the presidency and the nation as a whole.
But didn't his lavish lifestyle also draw some criticism?
Yeah.
Weren't some people concerned about his spending habits, especially given the economic disparities of the time?
You're right, there were critics. Some people saw his focus on luxury and extravagance as being out of touch with the struggles of ordinary Americans.
Right.
They argued that he should be more focused on addressing issues like poverty and inequality.
That's a valid point. It sounds like a debate that could easily happen today.
Absolutely. The question of how much presidents should spend on themselves, their families, their lifestyle.
Mm-hmm.
It's a perennial issue. It's a balancing act between the demands of public service and the personal lives of those who hold high office.
And it seems like Arthur erred on the side of extravagance, but perhaps he saw it as an investment, as a way to showcase America's wealth and power to the world.
That's certainly one way to interpret it, and it raises the question of whether such displays of opulence are ultimately effective or whether they simply reinforce perceptions of elitism and detachment.
It's a tough question, and there's probably no easy answer.
Right.
But it's definitely something worth thinking about.
It is, and it speaks to the complexities of presidential leadership.
Mm.
Every decision a president makes, from policy choices to personal conduct, is subject to scrutiny and interpretation. And often there are no easy answers or simple solutions.
Okay, so we've got this fascinating mix of reform, modernization style, and controversy. It's a lot to take in, but it paints a vivid picture of this accidental president who left a lasting impact on American history.
Indeed, Arthur's story is a reminder that the presidency is full of surprises, that individuals can evolve and change, and that even those who come to power through unexpected circumstances can leave behind a legacy that shapes the nation's future.
Now, I know you've been diligently taking notes throughout this deep dive, and I'm curious what stands out to you as the most surprising or insightful aspect of Arthur's story.
That's a great question. Honestly, what really strikes me is the contrast between Arthur's early career, steeped in the corrupt world of New York politics, and his transformation as president. To see him embrace reform, champion civil service, and modernize the Navy, it's a remarkable evolution. It challenges our assumptions about who these historical figures were
Yeah,
and the possibilities for personal growth and change, even at the highest levels of power.
I totally agree. It's almost like he had this hidden potential, this capacity for leadership that no one, perhaps not even himself, fully recognized until he was thrust into the spotlight.
Exactly. It's a reminder that sometimes greatness emerges in the most unexpected of places. And it makes you wonder what other hidden stories are out there waiting to be uncovered. What other forgotten figures might hold lessons for us today?
Now you're getting me excited for our next deep dive.
Yeah.
But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's bring this one to a satisfying conclusion. What final thought would you leave our listener with something to ponder as they reflect on Chester A. Arthur's legacy?
I think the question you posed earlier about Arthur's lavish lifestyle is an excellent one to leave them with. How do we reconcile his personal extravagance with his commitment to public service? Was he a hypocrite? Or was he simply a product of his time? It's a question that invites us to consider the nature of leadership, the complexities of morality, and the challenges of judging historical figures through a contemporary lens.
It's a thought-provoking question, and it reminds us that history is not about easy answers or simple judgments.
Right.
It's about grappling with nuance, ambiguity, and the messy realities of human nature.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so fascinating.
Well said. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I encourage you, our listener, to continue exploring, to seek out the hidden stories, and to challenge your own assumptions about the past. Because in those forgotten corners and those overlooked chapters, you might just find unexpected insights and new perspectives that enrich your understanding of the world around you.
And who knows, you might even rediscover a forgotten president whose story deserves to be told and whose legacy continues to shape our lives today.
Absolutely.
Right.
So keep questioning, keep learning, and keep diving deep. Until next time, happy listening. It's funny, as we've been going through all this stuff about Chester A. Arthur, I keep thinking about this whole idea of forgotten presidents. It's like there's this hierarchy of presidential memory.
Right.
You know, some are like household names and others just fade away.
Yeah, it's true. You have the icons that everyone knows,
Right.
Washington, Lincoln, FDR.
Right?
Then you have the presidents who are well regarded by historians, but maybe not as familiar to the average person, guys like Polk or Cleveland.
Right.
Maybe even Arthur himself falls into that category.
And then you have the presidents whose names even history buffs might struggle to remember.
Exactly. Millard Fillmore, Franklin Pierce.
Oh, yeah.
They're kind of at a historical twilight zone.
So what determines a president's staying power in like our collective memory? Is it just accomplishments or is there something else going on?
I think it's a combination of things. Big achievements definitely play a role.
Yeah.
Winning a war, enacting major legislation.
Right.
But personality is important too.
Yeah.
The charismatic presidents,
Mhm.
the ones with a good story or a memorable image, tend to stick with us.
Like Teddy Roosevelt with his Rough Rider persona or JFK and his youthful charm.
Right, they become larger-than-life figures.
Exactly. And then you have the presidents who are linked to a particular era or a defining moment in history.
Yeah.
Nixon and Watergate,
Mhm.
Reagan and the end of the Cold War. They become part of the narrative, which guarantees them a spot in our historical memory.
Exactly.
So where does that leave Arthur? He did some important things, like we've been discussing.
Right.
But he wasn't exactly Mr. Charisma,
Yeah.
and his presidency didn't have like any major wars or crises.
Right.
Plus, he burned a bunch of his papers.
Yeah, he's kind of an in-between figure.
Yeah.
He made important contributions, but he wasn't flashy, and his time in office lacked the drama that often makes a president memorable.
Yeah.
That and those missing papers make it harder to get a full picture of the guy.
Yeah. It's almost like he slipped through the cracks of history, overshadowed by more dramatic or memorable figures.
Yeah, it's possible.
And yet, as we've seen in this deep dive, his story is worth remembering. His journey from the corrupt world of patronage to championing reform, his modernization of the Navy, his wrestling with issues like immigration and the budget surplus, these are all relevant to how we understand American history and the presidency itself.
I agree.
It's a great reminder that there's always more to uncover. Even the forgotten presidents have something to teach us.
Absolutely. History isn't just about the big names and the grand narratives.
Right.
It's about individuals who, through their actions and decisions, shaped the course of events, even in subtle ways.
Well said. And on that note, I want to thank you for guiding us through this deep dive into the life and times of Chester A. Arthur. It's been a fascinating journey.
It has been.
And to our listener, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep. We'll be back soon with another deep dive into a new topic. Until then, happy listening.